Okay. All right. We'll get ready to get started. Thanks everybody for coming in, and also for people on virtual. We are really pleased today to have Social Standards with us. This is, I think, the fifth time we've done this at this conference. Jordan Breslauer is here. He's the VP of Data Analytics and Customer Engagement. I get a long title to some other stuff.
Yeah.
I'll probably forget, but Jordan is going to run us through a quick presentation deck first, and maybe just to start, you can just sort of give the setup, Social Standards, what you do, what you deliver, and then go through the deck and then run through some questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks so much, Brian. I mean, it's always a pleasure to get to do this year and year for 5 years straight, and really excited to get to show you some insights today. So high level, who are we as Social Standards? The best way to think about us is as the Nielsen of social, in that Nielsen uses UPC codes to structure their data. We use linguistic UPC codes, meaning we have a natural language processing machine that feeds information to a team of linguists who go ahead and do the tough job of structuring human language with all the nuances and ambiguity that exist in the way in which people talk, in the way in which people speak. And that allows for us to better understand trends in consumer data, but also understand what differentiates brands from one another, and a lot of the why behind the what we're seeing in the marketplace. So let's start off with some different consumer trends we've been seeing in food and in beverage alcohol. The chart we're looking at here, on the y-axis, you can see the size of different thematic topics that are a collection of a variety of different words and phrases that people would use to describe that particular concept. So things that are higher up on the y-axis, those are larger topics within Instagram food and beverage conversations. And then the x-axis is helping us to see how it's shifting over time. So things to the right of that vertical line are growing, while things to the left of that vertical line are declining. And so what you'll notice is over the past year, we've seen a shift away from some topics around health and kind of a re-engagement around things related to social activities, like nightlife and partying, like travel, things like music and adventure. And I think that kind of represents a shift a little bit back to normalcy in some ways. If you look at some of this is year over year, but if you look at some of these trends over the course of 26 months, a lot of them are returning to the pre-pandemic levels. And in some way, within the food and beverage alcohol landscapes, we're starting to see that return to normalcy. And so what we wanted to show here was some categories that would benefit or have been benefiting from that shift. So here on the x-axis, things that are above that or to the right of that vertical line, those are over-indexed in relation to nightlife and partying, and things to the left of it are under-indexed with nightlife and partying. And then the y is in regard to health benefits. So things above that horizontal line, over-indexed with health benefits, being below, under-indexed with health benefits. And so ultimately what we see is a lot of the categories that are benefiting from this shift, they're the ones that are associated with nightlife and partying. So coffee, soda, energy drinks, alcohol, and a lot of foods that would play in the QSR space like pizza or hamburgers. The things that are down are things like healthy snacks, at-home meals, meat substitutes, and non-dairy milk. And kind of continuing on that latter point, so those key plant-based categories like non-dairy milk and light meat substitutes, they continue to have lost some steam on social over the past year and 24 months. You can see here the blue line is representative of the trend in non-dairy milk conversation. The gray line is representative of the trend in meat substitutes conversation. And we can see over the past 12 months about a 29% decline in non-dairy milk, and meat substitutes about a 20% decline. And over the 24-month period, pretty similar, a little bit opposite, so 20% decline on non-dairy milk and 30% decline on meat substitutes conversations. And that little bump that we tend to see around January, that seems to coincide with people making New Year's resolutions. There's also like an Instagram holiday called Veganary, where people make vegan commitments. So that's a little bit what you see going on there. But those things are just kind of becoming more fleeting and more temporary over time, not as big as they might have been in the pre-pandemic times. In addition, within the non-dairy milk space, we're seeing some of these conversations shift from almond to oat. So the y-axis here representative of penetration or co-occurrence of non-dairy milk conversations. The x-axis is the change year over year. So you can see here, oat and almond, the two biggest. Soy further down on the list, a little bit more not changing too much year over year. Oat continues to grow, while almond milk continues to decline as a share of non-dairy milk conversation. So if there's any portion of the non-dairy milk category that is growing, it's oat, not as much almond. But one of the big brands, of course, within that space is Oatly. And so as all these new entrants come into the space in oat milk, we have seen their share of conversations go down. And think about when people talk about oat milk, they're not always talking about it in a branded way. So that 8% you see back in January of 2020, that was the leader in the category. Still is the leader in the category, but that is now down to about 3.5% of all oat milk conversations. So over the past 24 months, about a 57% decline in share of oat milk conversation. And the last thing on food and beverage I want to share, a really interesting thing. About 5 years ago when we first came here, we talked about how hard seltzers were going to be one of the next big things in the beverage alcohol category. And we used a lot of signals in order to make that determination. Some of it had to do with the trajectory of conversation. It also had to do with the user retention or month over month stickiness of people talking about that topic. In addition, we also saw that that category was highly associated with a lot of the key health and wellness trends that were permeating both food and beverage alcohol at the time. And so, collectively, those were signals that hard seltzer was really poised for success into the future. We're seeing a lot of these similar sorts of signals that we would look for trending categories appear not at the same extent, but certainly to a notable extent within the collagen drink space. So here you can see the trend in collagen drink conversation over the last 26 months. It's up about 41% over the past year and up 129% over the past 24 months. So people really trying to find ways to have beauty from within, from the products that they're consuming in their food and beverage. It seems to be a trend that we're seeing. Now, what's also interesting, think back to earlier, we saw health benefits going down, but the part of it that seems to be going up is the functional portion. Some of the free-from, some of the lifestyle diets, those appear to be more down. And also things around COVID, consciousness, those appear to be down over the past year, while the portions of health that are growing are much more functional related. The thing to note, though, about the current size of the space, is it a micro trend? Is it becoming more of a potential larger trend? I don't want to say macro trend just yet. Is in terms of its size in social conversations, it's right around about 60% the size right now of sports drinks. So when you consider that in terms of comparable size, it's pretty notable in terms of where it's reached from a social stature. We also looked at the level of user retention. So it's a chart that helps us to understand the loyalty around particular products and topics. So it measures, did the people who spoke about that product category last quarter speak about it again this quarter? And we see where collagen drinks ranks. It ranks above different functional beverages. It ranks above sports drinks. It is below that of some very, very niche loyal categories like third wave coffee. People who participate in that space, they're highly brand loyal, highly engaged around more niche coffee than the more mass coffee. So to see that relative to some of these key categories that it might be comparable to, like sports drinks or functional beverages, that's pretty strong user retention. In addition, I always look for something that's hitting on cross-category trends. So if you think back to hard seltzer, it was hitting upon these health and wellness trends like keto at the time that were going across both food and beverage alcohol. In this case, one of the big trends we see moving across beauty and food and beverage is anti-aging. And here what we're looking at is which food and beverage products are most often mentioned on the y-axis alongside anti-aging. And then the x-axis is taking into account year-over-year change. Collagen drinks on this list is only number 2 to the tea space. And if you think about tea, it's got like wellness tea. There's lots of different segments, huge, huge category. Collagen drinks is number 2 here, and it's growing fast year over year. In terms of anti-aging as a trend, over the past 24 months, it's up 43% in beauty, and that's pretty tremendous growth when you consider that it's one of the largest benefits and concerns that is talked about on beauty on Instagram. And it's also up 25% within food and beverage conversations. So that's all to say, lots of signals that are indicating some strong growth potentially for collagen drinks as a category. The one thing I do think is pretty different versus hard seltzer is hard seltzer was very, very brand dominant. White Claw, when it came on the scene, was really driving a high percentage of the conversations. I want to say early on, when we came and talked in 2018, it had somewhere around 30 to 40% of all hard seltzer conversations at the time. That is very, very different from what we see with collagen drinks. So here's the chart that kind of shows brands and their presence in hard seltzer in the red bars, and then brands and their presence in collagen drinks in the green bars. And you can kind of see how this is much more leftward skewed, meaning that brand presence drives a much higher percentage of the conversations within the hard seltzer space than what we see with collagen drinks. And that's really notable because that means right now the trend is a little bit more consumer driven than it is brand driven, or arguably even more fragmented, where you have a lot of different really, really small brands that wouldn't even get a notable amount of volume within social conversations. So as we consider that, as we consider people taking these collagen powders, making their own collagen drinks, whether it be collagen coffee, collagen teas, or even participating in the prepackaged varieties. Sometimes there's like collagen shots that people are having. There seems to be a lot of opportunity given it's less brand driven right now. The brands that we have seen participate, of course, you see Vital Proteins, a little bit more of a niche health brand, but you do also see some beauty brands also participating. Shiseido is getting involved in the powdered variety. You also do see, of course, collagen in other forms, more of the topical forms, really taking off as an ingredient within the skincare space. So this cross-category trend really converging and coming into play in food and beverage, I think is a quite interesting trend to monitor over the next year and beyond. So now I'm going to shift a little bit into talking about hard seltzer, hard beverages in general, and the blurring of the hard seltzer category. So here we're just looking at a trend of all hard beverage conversations. So think about this as hard seltzer, prepared cocktails, hard iced tea, hard kombucha, anything you'd have hard in front of. And we can see here the trend in its conversations over the past 26 months. So we see that hard beverages is up about 14% over the 24-month period, but it's down about 15% year over year in terms of conversations. Of course, you can notice the seasonality, in large part driven by the hard seltzer space, where things tend to peak in the category in the summer months and drop in the winter months. So that's really notable because we're not really seeing the same sort of growth that we've seen for all the previous years, going back to 2018 for the category. So the social excitement has kind of tapered off. It ultimately is where it's at. Doesn't seem like these new entrants, whether they be prepared cocktails or other varieties, are necessarily incremental as much as they might be taking from hard seltzer as a category. And that kind of shows itself a little bit here. The blue bars here are representative of hard seltzer's penetration of hard beverage conversation, and the gray bars are prepared cocktails penetration of hard seltzer conversation. So we can see that over time, previous summers, we were at around mid 30% penetration of hard beverage conversations from hard seltzer. And then in the winter months, somewhere around the 20s. That's pretty much where we are. Not too much of a difference relative to the past. Certainly down relative to about 24 months ago. While prepared cocktails, you see that steady rise. And now as we sit in the current month, we have about 21% of the conversations in hard beverages are about hard seltzer, and then about 13% are prepared cocktails. So slowly closing the gap, somewhere around 60% the size, and that seems to have been changing a bit over time. And so ultimately, I think it comes down to this being like a two-horse race. It's down to hard seltzers, prepared cocktails. Here on the y-axis, we can see what is each of these different categories penetration of hard beverage conversations. Hard seltzer, highest on the list, still the biggest out of all of these, but you can see as the x-axis shows, it's been declining in share while prepared cocktails are up. Everything else is pretty small, right? Hard kombucha, that's down, but number 3 on this list. You see hard iced tea, which was something we had talked last year about. We had talked about, we had some signs that we weren't too confident about it taking off. It doesn't seem to have taken off. Yeah, I think it really comes down to it didn't have strong user retention. People tried it, it was a little bit of a leaky bucket, and they didn't really re-engage in the category. And then you see some other smaller ones here. You see hard sodas, that's up a bit. Some of that might be driven by the recent Super Bowl ad. We'll see how sustainable that ultimately ends up being. And when I say the recent Super Bowl ad, the one by Bud Light during the Super Bowl. So this is a very, very similar looking chart, but it's on a little bit of a different data set. So on the left side, we're looking at the penetration of hard seltzer users. So people who talk about hard seltzer, what categories do they talk about in general, as represented on the Y? And how is that changing over time, as represented on the X? And I think this just reiterates the point. The biggest threat, ultimately, to the hard seltzer category is prepared cocktails. Given what we've seen in the previous charts, it doesn't seem like there's so much that's incremental to the hard beverage space. So any sort of changes we're seeing are ultimately a shift that's happening from hard seltzer to prepared cocktails. Hard seltzer still is the biggest category, but that share is being dwindled into. Now, further fuel to that fire, on the right side, we can see what is the user retention levels of a variety of different hard beverage categories. And who's number 1 there? Well, it's prepared cocktails. Hard seltzer is further towards the middle of that chart. So I think that's a really interesting, notable observation. It seems like prepared cocktails have higher consumer loyalty than some of the competitive categories in hard beverages. It's also interesting to note hard kombucha there. You know, I think that kind of shows you hard kombucha is what it is. It's got this loyal consumer base, but it's not necessarily showing growth.
Which is an acquired taste.
It is an acquired taste. It is very much an acquired taste. So then, just to kind of dig into what's driving some of the differentiation in the consumer's mind between hard seltzer and prepared cocktails. Here on the X, you can see the difference in the representation of different topics within hard seltzer conversation and prepared cocktails. So things to the right of that vertical line, those are more skewed towards the hard seltzer space, while things to the left of the vertical line are more skewed towards prepared cocktails. The y-axis is once again acknowledging that user retention metric. So what's this really interesting curve we see of this chart? I think it's like super, super interesting. A lot of the different topics that skew more towards prepared cocktails, these are things that have much higher user retention. Things like holidays. If you're a holiday consumer, if you talk about Christmas, you tend to talk about other holidays. Things like nightlife and partying. Also packaging and even sustainability, skewing a bit more towards the prepared cocktail space. While the things that are skewing more towards hard seltzer, sure, flavor does have decently strong user retention, but some of these things around health benefits, at least within the beverage alcohol space, don't show the same sort of user retention. In food and beverage, they do, but in beverage alcohol, the health benefits don't seem to retain the consumers in the same way. And then also you see physical activity down there.
Does this chart also tie back to the chart you showed earlier where there's, you know, less of an interest in health and wellness and more of an interest in normalcy or whatever?
Yeah.
So is there any connection between also seltzers kind of started as a healthy alternative, right? and, you know, meaning as it really took off and maybe there's just less interest in healthy alternatives? Can you make that connection?
I think so. I think that all comes back to relations, which is really the backbone of what we do. I like to describe it sometimes as physics, right? If something's going to have momentum or lack of momentum,
Right.
it's due to what is pushing it, what it's known for in the consumer's mind. And so if the things that a category is associated with are growing, well, then it has a higher chance to grow. If the things it's associated with are declining, then it has a higher chance of declining. And so that's kind of what we see in here. Like a lot of the things that hard seltzer is associated with, as we've seen earlier, have been declining across the board,
Right.
not only in Bev-Al, but in the food and beverage space as well. A couple of last comments here. So this is just penetration of hard beverage conversation. List of different brands. Might be a little hard to read, but top one there is White Claw. But you can see that blue bar chart there is representing how that penetration has changed over time. And it's dropped a significant amount. It was around 20%, 22%, somewhere around 24 months ago. It's now all the way down to around 5% of the total hard beverage conversation. So that gap is starting to tighten. Notable there, though, you see number 2, is Topo Chico Hard Seltzer. I mean, that is super impressive when you consider what that Coca-Cola partnership and Molson Coors partnership has done, and their ability to become the number 2 brand overall in not only hard seltzer conversation, but in hard beverage conversation.
Do we
I think
know?
it's fascinating.
Do we know? Were people posting, or was the penetration of the Topo brand before the hard seltzer? You know, just with the Topo sparkling water, did that have like high penetration, or so did you you know, was it building off of a platform that was there already, or did it really just, you know, come with launching the hard seltzer?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think it did take a little bit of time for them to rise up, but they did come in when they launched. I want to say by March, they were in the top 10 of all hard seltzer brands in terms of penetration.
Right. By March of last year.
By March of last year, correct.
And that was with limited distribution also.
Correct,
Yeah.
correct. And I think that's actually a really good transition point to this next slide, which is kind of making the point that if there's all these new non-alc brands that are trying to get into the alcohol space. You have Topo Chico, you have Fresca with the Constellation Coca-Cola partnership. You have Hard Mountain Dew just launching in the past couple weeks. And like the question everybody's asking is which ones of these are going to be most successful? And I think back to Topo Chico is kind of the gold standard right now for which ones have been the most successful from the launch. And why were they successful? Well, one of the things to think about is Topo Chico has pretty consistently been associated with the Bev-Al space, particularly with cocktails, well before it ever launched into the space. If you think back for a while, people have been making drinks with Topo Chico. And this is kind of trying to represent some of that here. The y-axis, which is what I really want you to pay the most attention to here, is giving you a sense if cocktails as a topic are over or under indexed in that non-alcoholic beverage brand. So of course, you see brands like Fever Tree here. Fever Tree, kind of that premium mixer, people use it in gin. That's why people use Fever Tree. Not many people drink Fever Tree just on its own. It is a cocktail mixer. And then you have some other brands that you see there that are over-indexed. We see Schweppes. People have lots of different cocktails with Schweppes. You have Topo Chico up there. You also have Fresca up there as well. And then you see some brands that are very under-indexed in their association with the cocktail space. Like, for example, you see Pepsi or Monster or even Arizona under-indexed. People aren't necessarily making cocktails with those particular types of beverages. So I think it's interesting to see where Mountain Dew is positioned on this chart. Mountain Dew, relative to some of these other brands that have recently launched into the cocktail space, their food and beverage conversation, or I should say just beverage conversations, that are in total are just less representative of cocktails relative to the norm than some of these others that have forayed into the space. And so from our perspective, if you want to be successful in the prepared cocktail space, you want to have that built-in association with the cocktail category. And that's why it really makes sense how Topo Chico was successful, going back to your previous point. And it seems as if early on, some of the early results we're seeing for Hard Mountain Dew, it's not near that level that Topo Chico is at. On the right, I'm just noting the first couple weeks of the launch and comparing that to where Topo Chico was at in its first couple weeks of the launch. Topo Chico has about 4x the amount of social conversations during that period that Hard Mountain Dew had. And here on the left, kind of just reiterating that point around cocktail association. The line going horizontally there is that median association with cocktails. Topo Chico continuously is over-indexed on that particular association, while Mountain Dew has either floated around the line or even been under-indexed in that association with cocktails. And so as a result, I think it makes a lot of sense why it hasn't necessarily had the early social success that Topo Chico has had. I think it bears to be seen. Of course, a lot can still happen, but that's somewhat the early results from social media have indicated about the differences between these two launches. And so, yeah.
Thanks, Jordan.
There you go.
So want to make sure anybody who wants to ask a question, you can. I guess want to go back first to the plant-based part of the presentation, and maybe first to start looking at the trends for Oatly.
Yeah.
And so how should we interpret? I mean, I look at that, and in my mind, it suggests that the brand is, potentially it's a flashing sign, right? It's not a good sign. And we've seen this with other brands. So is that the correct interpretation of this chart? Are there other variables that we're not considering? For instance, people post about oat milk, they don't care about brands, or aren't as concerned on brands. Just how would we interpret that?
Yeah, there is one variable that's kind of hiding behind this chart that I think is important to consider. So we could look at all oat milk brands and understand their share of oat milk conversation. We could also look at all food and beverage brands. And the one that actually has the highest share of all oat milk conversation right now is Starbucks. So when people are talking about getting an oat milk latte at Starbucks, I mean, technically, if I'm not mistaken, it is Oatly that they're using based upon the partnership. Can it depend?
Yeah, it depends on where you are in the country.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So it depends on where you're in the country, but maybe in mass, it is Oatly. And as a result, when people are talking about Starbucks oat lattes, they're not necessarily attributing it to Oatly, but so that's not necessarily having a benefit for the brand, but I assume there's commercial benefits there.
Right.
So that's an important consideration, that there might have been an expansion of this food services business that isn't necessarily taken into account in the conversations here.
An ingredient.
Correct.
Not a brand.
That's a great way to put it. Okay. It's an ingredient, not a brand. And so there's not really, I don't have great data right now, given that there's like a decreasing co-occurrence there between Starbucks and Oatly, to say that people would necessarily care if it was a different oat milk brand.
Right. Okay. And then I guess as we're thinking about plant-based in general, is there some fatigue, I guess? And again, in looking at some of the previous charts you put out, just seemed like, maybe we're, seeing a little bit of consumer fatigue, whether it's plant-based meat substitutes, non-dairy milks. Is that like a good sort of way to read that chart?
I think so. I think there's a little bit of fatigue. I think that it has reached a lot more people over the last couple of years than it had in the past. And what I think is going on is you had some people join the category, but you don't necessarily have as many new entrants as you did before.
Right.
And so the people that are really sticking around, from what we see, I think it's really even more so in the meat substitute space than it is in the non-dairy milk space. Somewhere around 75% of all meat substitutes conversation makes some allusion to either a lifestyle diet, which could include veganism,
Right,
or a particular health benefit.
right.
That's a really large number, it's like 3/4 of the conversations. So it doesn't feel as if the participation in the category is really due to other variables at
Right,
this
it's
point.
not emotional, it doesn't taste good, it's more
Correct.
about almost medicinal, right?
Correct. Exactly. Exactly.
Okay.
Not even as much sustainability.
Right.
Yes, it depends on certain brands, but for the most part, the participation is health. Sure, it over indexes on sustainability, but it's just not a huge part of the driving of the conversation.
And then when we look at the conversations within plant-based dairy, and I think you had a chart before that showed how, almond and almond and oat are still the biggest, but almonds declining. Does this at all give us a sense that maybe there's a non-dairy milk ceiling, if you will? Meaning, there's a certain subset of consumers who will use it for certain occasions, but does this sort of tell us maybe that there's not this major sort of transition, if you will, from cow's milk to plant-based?
Yeah. We've been looking at this for a while with you guys, and I think one of the interesting observations is a lot of the conversion of oat milk, for example, is coming more from other non-dairy milks. It's coming from almond, it's coming from soy. It's not as much coming from regular dairy milk. And so it's kind of battling each other. And as
Right.
a result, if you don't see the total category going up, it doesn't seem like it's very incremental. And that could suggest there's somewhat of a ceiling. I will say a little bit different from oat relative to some of these other categories is it has a little bit more versatility. So in terms of the associations, almond is very health concentrated.
Right.
Oat at least has a lot more with sustainability. And it also has a lot more in combination with different types of foods and
Other
drinks.
dairy products, ice creams, yogurt.
Correct. Ice cream, yogurts, but also even people combining it with coffee.
Right.
Or people combining it with cereals. You don't see that as much for almond. Almond's like almost baking and
Oh, wow.
bowls that people are making, like the
Okay.
power bowls.
Right.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jordan. Actually, just wanted to go back to your collagen slide that you had
Sure.
there and the association with, I guess, with beauty. I mean, and I can't see down there on the left, but what are some of the factors that people are cutting out? Is it, hey, this person also talks about a low or no alcohol diet, or they also don't eat red meat, and that feeds into their
It's a really good
health and
question.
wellness.
A really good question, and it's something I really should follow up with in terms of who that anti-aging consumer is. I think as you think about it in the beauty space, they tend to be a very ingredient conscious consumer, like looking for products that have high ingredient transparency. As you think about that consumer across categories, they tend to hit on a lot of different ESG aspects. They're a more sustainable customer. They care more about things around human rights. They care more about brands being conscious. So I think there is a connection there in terms of who that anti-aging consumer is, and as a result, the different types of products they might consume, which could lend itself, as you said, to maybe being less of a red meat consumer. I do think in general, though, what you're seeing is people, when it comes to anti-aging and skin health in general, they're not just thinking about it from a topical perspective. They're thinking about it in a variety of different manners, extending to supplements in addition to different aspects of their food and beverage activity.
Thanks. And then on your 2-horse race slide, that I actually found that very interesting. It's either hard seltzers or canned, RTD cocktails. I guess for the also rans or the tweeners, is there a commonality that they share that the consumer's talking about? Why those are failing? Is it the iced tea and the hard soda products are too sweet? What's kind of the driver there? I mean, Topo Chico certainly would lend itself to maybe less sweet, and is that having a positive impact? Just curious what you've seen.
Good question. So the Topo Chico flavor stands out more for them relative to a lot of the other hard seltzer brands. Even though flavor is strong for hard seltzer in general, it's even stronger for Topo Chico. And sorry, your first question again was the tweeners. Got it. Yeah. So the tweeners, yeah. I think if you look at hard iced tea, taste over-indexed, but tasty under-indexed. So, and that's weird because Instagram is actually so positive in nature. Of course, we analyze other data sources as well, but yeah, that's not a good sign. When you see a difference between the two of those, it generally could be an indication that people might be calling it out in more of a negative way. In addition, when it comes to some of the other tweeners like hard soda, hard soda's had flashes in the past as well, and that user retention on it is just never that strong. I can't totally say right now on Bud Light hard soda because the Super Bowl just happened. It has this buzz, but let's see by next month and the month following what the retention is in conversations of those different consumers, because even in terms of size right now, it's just not close to the others, and it had this huge expenditure coming from a large brand in the Super Bowl.
When we're looking at ready-to-drink cocktails, oh, I think we got a question here. Sorry.
Please. How do you see the conversations on social interacting with in-store sales and other activations that brands may be doing on non-social media platforms? What does that actually look like, and especially as it translates to sales?
Good question. So, when we first started talking with Brian, one of the things that was really interesting in our first conversations is we have a partnership with Nielsen. So we had overlaid sales data next to our structured social data. And I don't want to say there's a correlation across everything. They tell us different things. But Nielsen sales data is off-premise. It's store sales, right? Grocery convenience. Social could be on-premise, could be off-premise, could be at a brewery, could be at your home, etc. So what we tried to do was isolate it to categories that at the time were very off-premise. One of those at the time was hard seltzer. And hard seltzer showed a very, very strong relationship at that time to the sales curve. And given that you saw that, it kind of gave us some fuel and belief from that data that social can give you information on the why behind the what. Really, why are consumers going with this trend? Much like when we looked at these slides here, helping you to understand why our prepared cocktails, what's driving those conversations versus hard seltzer. So hopefully that helps to answer the question in terms of the connection point. I would say in the beverage alcohol space, you're going to see the tightest connections in store sales to the products that are more off-premise than the products that are more on-premise. So I wouldn't expect to see it with craft beer, for example. Craft beer, highly on-premise, people drinking it at breweries. Wine is another very on-premise category, even though there's off-premise consumption as well, people drinking a lot at restaurants, as opposed to traditionally categories like hard seltzer that might be a bit more off-premise.
All right. If we don't have any other questions, I think we have about 30 seconds left. So Jordan, I want to thank you.
Of course.
Very much.
Thank you so much. This has been great.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.